All right, cool. We're gonna go ahead and get started. So, hey everyone. My name is Joel. I think I know almost every single person here. I've like interacted with almost all of you at some point. Thanks for joining us today. We're joined here with this is our sixth or seventh of what we're calling the Shorashim staff series. We're kind of reevaluating them in an ongoing basis, but. Today we are actually here with Howard, who's in this screen next to me, probably not the same screen that's next to all of you. And every year we run a trip, which we call the Asperger's trip. And basically what Howard's going to be talking us through is a little bit more about some of Birthright Israel's specialty trips and a little bit more about what we can actually learn from it. So I'm just going to kick it over to Howard. If you have any questions throughout this entire time, there will be a little bit of interactivity throughout the session, but please put it in the chat. It's a really interesting topic, and we're really glad all you guys are here with us today. So with that being said, Howard, I'm gonna kick it over to you.
Thank you very much, Joel, and thank you, Michael, for the kind invitation. I'm not a paid spokesperson for Shorashim, but I can say it's been an amazing pleasure working with Shorashim in terms of organization and attentiveness to detail. And I've led, I don't know, 4 or 5 Asperger's trips. I've also led a number of Camp Ramah trips, some Birthright and some otherwise. So I'd like to get into this now. The next slide. And once that I'm going to turn in a second, is some of our goals for today. So I'd like to talk about, as Joel said, options for people with disabilities, accommodations and supports. I really want to focus on this idea of Israel being the ultimate multisensory learning environment. And really the real take home is to learn how to bring this back to your own to other trips, to the more typical trips. I certainly didn't know the different trips that were offered for different special populations before I started leading this Asperger's trip. And I'd like to offer you a challenge, and please write this in the chat. If you have any idea of the different trips that Birthright offers for special populations, I'm going to say it in a very non-specific way, just any trips that you might know that meet the needs of different people. So please just write that in the chat for a minute, and then I will share with you the different trips. So I don't see any answers yet. I see some are coming in. There's a Yachad trip. Okay, somebody wrote down deaf, hard of hearing, Asperger's, LGBTQIA, motor disabilities. Excellent. So I want to share the list because this is really, really impressive to me. At the end, I'll tell you how I came to learn about these trips. But we're going on approximately 20 years of Birthright offering accessibility trips, quite a big range of age, 2,000 plus participants, over 75 trips. And as you can see from the list, some of them, as you said, are specific to things like sign language and Asperger's, intellectual disabilities. But of course, many people with disabilities are included and offered support on the typical trip. I know that I want to share a story that I find really, really inspiring. And it really speaks to how far Birthright will go to accommodate various special circumstances. I was told that there was a story of a young man who applied for a Birthright trip. He was deaf, and he also was a person who used a wheelchair all the time. And as I heard this story, Birthright said, okay, you'll go on the physical disabilities trip and we'll have an interpreter. And he was very adamant. And he said, no, he said, my community is the deaf community. Those are my people. I happen to have a physical disability, but that's really my community. And he basically, Birthright, I think I was told, I think $10,000 later, he was on a deaf trip, which was made fully accessible. So I want to share with you, if they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, I guess a video is worth 10,000 words. So for the next 3 or 3.5 minutes, I want to give you a picture. This is kind of hot off the presses, not widely available yet, but enjoy watching some of Birthright's offerings.
2 years ago, I saw an ad that said, kids in wheelchairs go rappelling. And I was like, what?
It literally took me a second, and I said, I'm in.
Some of us can't see well, and some of us can't talk or walk. The trip has given us the opportunity to come together and to be able to shine and show our abilities.
I wanted to see Israel. I wanted to see it for myself. I wanted to see my Jewish lineage and heritage.
$58,000 Taglit birthright participants came this year. Why not people with disabilities? There's no question about it. They're part of the Jewish world, they're part of all of our world, they're part of society, and they must come here.
This country is just as much ours as it is everyone else's. And it's important that we show that we can have access to it too, and that we can invite more people to join Birthright who say, oh, I really wanted to do Birthright, but how do I do that?
I had a note that I had spent all night writing, and as soon as I touched the wall, I started sobbing.
When they wrote down that came at the hotel, they had like real harsh realities that they deal with, that they are wishing real strong wishes, very different than like a regular group.
When we just went down from the bus and the entrance to the market, usually they walk around the streets, they try to be as small as they can, not to hit anyone, not to disturb anyone. And here they just got off the bus in a different country, in a different mentality, in a different society, and just got together and danced like crazy. And I see that and I said, that's it. We did our share.
I've learned a lot about myself and finding my Jewish identity and learning that everybody's Jewish identity is different.
I made some lifelong friends here, and it's something that I will never forget.
It was a life-changing experience.
So you've certainly heard the story and seen much better than I could articulate it. I love this video. Let's put our heads together and think about what goes into actually planning a special populations trip. And I'm going to be very non-specific. I know that, as you saw from the different trips offered, that's a very wide net that we're talking about. But if you could write in the chat to everyone some of the different things in your thinking that would go into planning a trip like any special populations trip, that would be great. So I'll give you a minute or two to write in the chat. So I see somebody's talking about living accommodations, which we'll get back to, accessible hotels and attractions. Yes, looking at the staffing is very crucial. Structure, interpreters for some trips. Yeah, accessible transportation, that's a big one for certain trips. Excellent. So everybody has so far. I see some terrific peers, making it a peer group. Whether it's being included in a more typical trip or a peer group within the trip. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk a lot about some of our Asperger's trip and how that has really become a chevra for that group. So I'm going to advance the slides. So in my experience, again, a lot of you picked up on some of these points. A lot happens on the front end in terms of planning the trip. I think for all of us, once we hit the ground in Israel, in a way, that's the easiest part of the trip, right? Once the structure is in place. I'm going to mostly draw from my experience with the Asperger's group for now. Certainly, as people said, structure and predictability as much as possible, adhering to a routine. Of course, sometimes things come up, things change, but in our staffing experience, we do our best to announce changes in advance. Families often ask how the trip is structured, and I try to explain that, of course, every day's attraction is different, but the general structure is the same. We wake up at the same time each morning, we get up, we go to breakfast, then the attraction of the day starts. We usually have lunch out on the road, and we do our whole day of activity, and then we come back, and from dinner on, Pulat Erev, we're in the hotel. So that general structure is the same so that people can shower and wind down. In terms of accommodations, again, someone mentioned this in the chat. For the Asperger's trip, we really strive to do as few hotel changes as possible. Usually we manage to keep it down to 3 hotel changes. We've even talked about 2, so that by being based in the center, like around outskirts of Jerusalem, it allows you to do Tel Aviv, as far south as the Dead Sea, Jerusalem, places like that. And then a place in the north allows for a lot of movement within the north of Israel. By doing that, fewer hotel changes, it lets people have a sense of having a base. It allows for less packing and unpacking, which has been, in our experience, is really tough with participants whose stuff can get all over the place. You feel a little bit more at home at your base. I really can't say enough about not just tour educators. People put that in the chat about adaptive guides. I would say, versatile guides who really know how to teach on many levels at the same time. I think of it as like leading children's services. I've done a lot of family services, children's services in synagogues. And sometimes you're teaching like the story, a tough story like Jonah or the Binding of Isaac, and you're teaching on the simple level for the kids, on a more complicated level for parents. So you have to the guides are really able to do that beautifully. Oftentimes using visuals, having the participants act out certain things, maybe involving the learners. I have a slide in a while that will bring that to life. Higher staff ratio, definitely more staff members on a trip with people with disabilities, regardless of the disability. And I put down expanded staff roles. So obviously when you're working with a more typical group, it doesn't feel so natural to say, oh, did you take your charger? Did you take your medication? On a trip like this, it's really crucial. We don't get involved with medication distribution, but we'll give a global reminder. We'll say, very quietly, anybody who takes breakfast medication, this is a good time to do that. I guess we call the person the sweeper. I see a few of our staff members from the Asperger's trip are on the call. We sort of get into this routine where, somebody goes back and we go to all the rooms and make sure that the phone chargers are taken, and shavers and adapters, because not only is it inconvenient if those are left behind, but people feel horrible without their stuff. So kind of offering those reminders in a global way. Of course, we also get into a whole routine about luggage in the lobby and then loading the buses. Something else that might not seem obvious, anybody who's traveled any place in the world knows that things don't always work in another country or in another hotel like they work in your house. The classic example is the toilet, right? Everybody's toilet works a certain way. Increasingly outside of Israel, we're learning how to save water with the 2 flushers, but that's not necessarily obvious. So explaining that, we had, I know, I'm sure my staff from this trip is gonna laugh, but God knows how many times some guys flooded those damn showers. You know, it happens. It's really hard to figure out Israeli showers. And, you know, sometimes it needs a real hand-on explanation, and also an explanation of how to get more towels by going down to the desk to help clean up. Or things like, you know, we've had times where we've gone to the locker room at the Dead Sea, and it's not so obvious. How does it work? I mean, you know, etiquette for changing in a locker room, and what do you do with your key, and what do you do with your stuff? So just offering basic explanations. Even things like how, you know, how does it work at a buffet, right? I mean, I guess that's all going to change going forward, but, you know, how do you navigate going through a buffet? You know, what's the flow of the line? Where do you take your plate? Of course, there are cultural differences. We tend to think that you should take a fresh fork, a fresh plate, not eat off the center. This is something we've had when we've done Bedouin tent, where it's can be very confusing when you're sitting on the floor and everyone's putting their fork into the center. So there's a lot of explanation. And I put this down as support and encouragement. I know TLC doesn't sound appropriate, but I think a little bit of that. And my example is when a parent calls about the trip, and I explain in what way an Asperger's trip is different than a more typical trip. I said, you know, when you climb up Masada, for example, up the Roman ramp, you have some people who will dash up to the top in a few minutes. You have some who'll be the middle of the pack. And then you have the total schleppers who think that they will never get to the top. So there's always going to be that staff member who's going to say, come on, Rachel, go girl, we're almost there. Let's do it. Should we sing a song? Should we drink some water? So that's the type of encouragement that is so important. And of course, as we'll see in the next slides and much of the rest of the presentation about hands-on activities. And I would like to propose that Israel is really a multi-sensory learning environment. It's really the ultimate learning environment, okay? And in fact, I think Israel itself makes planning a trip easier since so much of Israel can be explored through our various senses. So what I'd like to ask you to do now is to think for a minute about what sensory experiences you've had in Israel, you personally. And in case you forgot the different senses, here's a picture and there's some words. I know if you Google 5 senses, sometimes people tell you there's 2 more senses, vestibular and proprioceptive, but let's stick with these 5 for now. No extra credit for the other 2. But think for a minute about some sensory experiences you may have had in Israel. So I love what Rebecca said, that the echo deck at Masada. Every great tour guide, and I know we have a tour guide who's on this call, that beautiful echoing that comes from the top of Masada. What else? Take a minute or 2, please. Oh, love it. Thank you, Lacey. The different flavors and foods at the markets. Yeah, whether it's Machane Yehuda or whether it's place at the Shuk HaPishpishim in Tel Aviv, if you go there, the feeling the kotel, sunrise at the Masada. So the different things you could see, how colorful the markets are. I see that Zach is mentioning the Sign Language Museum, Invitation to Silence. We're going to talk about that in another slide. That actually was a favorite of the Asperger's trip. Artwork, Judaica. I know some people really love the graffiti teal. I love that. Floating in the Dead Sea, so that sensory feeling, even if it burns. Okay, these are terrific. You can keep them coming. I will share a few, which are probably, we'll start with the more obvious ones. things like we said Dead Sea. That was, someone also said hearing different conversations. That's a great one. The Dead Sea, Machane Yehuda. Some groups have done tree planting, so you're feeling the land. You can see in the slide on the right, Aaron from one of our trips is planting a tree. The guys in the center are eating. It could have been ice cream, it could have been falafel or shawarma, especially as the tchina is dripping down your chin. The one on the left, it really tries to illustrate some of the things that people have said so far about the different colors and the feels that you see in the various marketplaces. Someone said the emotions of being in these different holy places. I want to shift now to some of the elements of some of the favorites on the Asperger's trip. And again, the reason for showing all of these is that these can probably be incorporated into any trip. And it doesn't, trust me, everybody loves animals. It doesn't sound it's not infantilizing or juvenile. I still like to go to zoos, and I'm a much older guy. I still like animals. For many years, Rabbi Elise Winnick had been the coordinator of the Asperger's trip. And when we had spoken, one piece of advice she had was, anything having to do with animals. So animals will go a long way in planning the trip. So on the left picture, camels, that's obvious. Everybody does camels, okay? The picture in the center, this young man on one of our Tikva birthright trips is holding a small animal. And you might say, like, well, what is that? Why would you come all the way to Israel just to hold a small animal? You could do that in California, where he lives. It turns out that on this particular trip, we spent a few hours at the Pinat Chai, the animal corner, but it was really like a zoo at Kibbutz Shluchot near Beit Sha'an in Israel. And it turns out that the person who runs the animal area basically is a social worker who made Aliyah like 20 years ago, and all of the workers in that animal area are all people with developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities. So it was also an opportunity to learn from peers as well as working with animals. The top right, you probably guessed, it's the Ramat Gan safari, which was also they really loved that. But again, in addition to going on the bus and seeing animals as you're walking, as you're driving around, we also had a chance to walk through the zoo. And as somebody said, it's the listening, it's the hearing conversations, it's the seeing the kinds of ice cream that they sell and comparing in what way is that zoo different than your zoo experience. The bottom right is another one that was a huge hit. It's Israel Guide Dog Center. And I think a big highlight of that trip many years ago was seeing a litter of dogs that had just been born. In addition to learning the process of how do they train dogs and things they might not have thought about, like what happens when the dog needs to retire. That dogs only have a working life of about 8 or 9 years. So we learned, it was very, very educational. Other things that groups have gone to over the years with animals, Ganguru, the only place to feed kangaroos outside of Australia, Gazelle Park. It was less popular on one of our trips, but also with animals, Biblical Zoo, some beautiful places for seeing birds and having bird demonstrations. So many ways to experience animals in Israel, and that was very popular for our group. So this is again more sensory, things through touch as well as through sight. And I'm going to get to Zach had put down in the chat invitation to silence, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But going left to right, when groups go to Leket, usually there are 2 different options depending on when you go. One is to work in the warehouse, kind of sorting vegetables with your group, which can be fun. Our Asperger's group kind of hit the wall after about 45 minutes. It gets a little tiring. It's a little hard to know what a good eggplant
Howard,
looks like.
Can you explain what Leket is for someone else that don't know?
I'm sorry, Joel. Sure. So Leket, it comes from the biblical verse in Leviticus that talks about leaving the corner of your fields for people who are poor. So in ancient times, if you're a farmer, you might think that because of your good farming and your good fortune, this is all your field. And the Torah comes to say, no, not so quick. You have to leave parts of it for less fortunate. People can come to the corners of your field. It's not trespassing. Things that are fallen, they can take. So a wonderful organization started in Israel. It's basically food rescue. Okay, so farmers will say, look, we're done picking tomatoes or picking peppers for the season. We're not going to get any more profit by continuing to pick the fields. We're going to, they'll call up Leket, the central food registry, and they coordinate groups. And if you call and say, I'd like to bring my family or my class or my bar mitzvah tour group or my birthright group, they'll say, okay, in Renana, we have picking tangerines on Tuesday. We have picking, cucumbers or red peppers. And you will become the color of the things that you pick. It's very sensory. And we've done mostly going to this central sorting place, but some years we've actually gone out to the fields. And it really gives the participants a sense of engaging with the land and really helping people. And then you can have conversations. People might not realize that there's a huge disparity, a very unequal distribution of wealth in Israel. There are a lot of poor people. And there's also a real sense of caring and pitching in and helping. And the food is really delivered to people who need it. It's really wonderful. I would encourage you, if you haven't done that, either with a group or with family or friends, when you go, that's Leket. It's been a really wonderful part of our trips. Another century, if you're going across, we've gone to an olive oil factory, which has actually been quite interesting, where they show how olive oil is made. But also there's a big sampling. They let you sample many different types of olive oil, taking bread and dipping it and getting an explanation. So you can see the woman with the apron on the right is explaining, and our participants are getting the explanation and then trying different things. I did not include a picture of the Decorina chocolate. Many of us have gone there at the base of the Kinneret to buy these really great chocolates from this family from Argentina that brought chocolates to Israel. But there's a wonderful workshop where you can actually decorate and mold chocolate. And obviously there's the sensory part of touching it, but you get to do a lot of sampling, which is really, really good. So that's fun and it's sensory. The picture at the top with that 89, everyone sitting on the ground, sometimes for Pulat Air, for nighttime activities, I know we've all had different speakers come or different musicians. Someone talk about the geopolitical situation in Israel. This was someplace in the north of Israel, in a kibbutz guest house. And a woman comes up with her car stuffed with t-shirts and all kinds of art supplies. And everybody got to make and assemble t-shirts, the kind of thing where you can put pine cones in the shape of an H for Howard and spray paint around it and take the pine cones off, and then you have a shirt like that. So it was sensory and it was fun. The two pictures that are kind of diagonal to each other, Invitation to Silence, Husband Allah Sheket, and Nala Ga'at. Whether you bring a birthright group there or you get to go on your own, highly encouraged. The invitation to silence, again, you might think this could be potential for disaster, taking a disabilities group and then taking away one of their senses to experience something. And it really consistently has been one of the most exciting birthright, the Asperger's trip places to go. Essentially, everybody gets noise canceling headphones. Everybody, including the staff, has to check all their stuff into a locker. So you go with absolutely nothing. And the guides are the most engaging people who are deaf. And the group is captivated for an hour and 15 minutes going through and doing things like ordering from a snack bar non-verbally, playing a trivia game in teams. And I would have never thought that people with Asperger's would have gone with the plan and kept the headphones on. And it is really, really wonderful. It's at the Holon Children's Museum. The diagonal one, Nala Ga'at, I'm sure some of you have been there before. Nala Ga'at is, it's called either Blackout Restaurant. There are many different parts to it. All of the waiters are blind. They also have a blind deaf theater group, and they have workshops. And I went with a group of educators, and it's a bit scary. It's not, you can't see a thing. It's the darkest place you've been in your entire life. And you're basically sitting and you're eating your meal when you can't see. And if you ever want to challenge yourself to try to go to a place with your eyes closed and eat the meal, someone has to explain where the chair is and where the fork is and where the knife is. And I will tell you privately that I'm writing an article about this for a publication. I spoke with one of the blind waitresses, one of the blind waiters, and I was told that one of the funniest things for them is that many people will eat with their hands because no one can see anyway. So people become very uninhibited and very comfortable eating like that. That last picture, you people could probably guess, that's the Tzfat candle factory. And our group really, really loves that. Sometimes they get to see some biblical scenes that are in candles. In this case, the person is demonstrating how to make Havdalah candles. Another one or two places that came to mind, we've gone to Ne'ot Kedumim. Sometimes we've used that as our place to do our wrap-up dinner, but it can also be used for workshops with like a sofer, like a scribe might come and show how he makes ink for writing the Torah. So Israel is a very, very sensory and experiential country. I didn't want to leave out the importance of meeting Israelis. Now, obviously, people, you're going to interact with Israelis in the market and in other places, but there's really room to be very intentional about this. And at the end of the day, you want your group to really interact with Israelis. And I think that you could write a doctoral dissertation on how these groups have the potential to change Israeli society and are, because it's exposure and interaction with people with disabilities, and you can really see that just because you have a disability doesn't mean you're not awesome and have these other areas of strength. So on the left picture, this is a very, very specific to the Asperger's trip. This is called EFI, EFI, which is the Israel Asperger's organization. And every year we've gone and we've done an interactive activity. Last year it involved eating a lot of pizza, way more pizzas than we knew what to do with, lighting Hanukkah candles, and we're kind of getting to know people. And for the staff, we've done some games together, but just kind of watching the group compare notes and watching our group hear about their army service or national service, and to see the wheels begin to turn and people say, I've had people say, it's good to know that if I lived in Israel, people like me would be able to serve the country. And many people do national service as well as army. If you skip over the middle picture to the right, there are two programs in Israel. One is called Special in Uniform, which is through JNF. One's called Equal in Uniform, which is through Akim, which is the largest disability organization in Israel. And we've actually gone on a couple of occasions. I have other pictures. We got to dress up in uniforms. We got to do jobs and hear from the participants about their jobs. And there's something very wonderful about watching your participants in a Tzahal uniform doing service. That was really amazing. The center picture is one of our Camp Ramah Israel trips. And basically, many Jewish camps bring an Israeli delegation. They bring a mishloach to camp. And the participants have a relationship with the shlichim. And that lasts in a summer where we have camp, which is every summer, but this summer, they have an ongoing relationship. So then to flip it around and have the participants go see their Israel friends in Israel, or to even be invited to their homes, is amazing. Now imagine what you learn. Think about how much you learn about someone from going into their home. What do they put on their walls? What kind of food and snacks do they serve? What kind of trees do they have? Oh, they have avocado trees, lemon trees. We don't have that in Minneapolis or Boston. That's really cool. We have this wonderful opportunity. A real a core value of our trips is in Israel with Israelis, being with Israelis. And we have had some amazing experiences on the Asperger's trip where, each consistently, it's like each Israeli is better than the next. And one year, I guess 2 years ago, we had a guy who said, would it be okay if we came to my house for dinner? And, his mom being, your sort of stereotypical Yemenite mother, this wasn't just a chance to go have a cookie and a drink. It was a multi-course meal. It was soup and it was hummus and it was rice and it was meat and everything. And that was an amazing experience. And then the two Israeli women on the trip, the young soldiers, one of them had a father who owned Roladin Bakery in Tel Aviv, and it happened to be Hanukkah. So we got the back of the house tour and a free donut of our choosing. But again, it was a chance to really see Israel. Of course, the third person, not to be left out, it was equally wonderful. Her father liked to do wood crafts, and he made these beautiful wood dreidels for each person in the group. Really, really extraordinary. It's a great opportunity to get to know Israelis. And again, I want to come back to this idea of amazing tour educators. We have really been blessed with guides, educators who really are part of the team. They really value our expertise with disabilities, and we value that person's knowledge of Israel, and really work together. And the three pictures I wanted to show, the one on the left in Sfat, the guide has figured out a way to involve at least two participants. One's holding the map, and one is sort of demonstrating how Israel is set up. On the right, I love this guide's being able to go with it. We had the participant in the orange vest basically knew so much about Israel's water resources. And the guide, and I always tell the guide, listen, please don't be offended. There's going to be someone on the trip who's going to know more than you about something, and just go with it, right? But that person's knowledge might be all about the year, 68, and they know every aspect of that, but they don't know everything that you know. So this guide, we got to, I guess, tell Don in the north, and you can see the guide took off his tour guide, certificate, his ID, and he handed it over to the young participant. And the participant, knocked it out of the park. He really just told everything about drip irrigation and everything about Israel's water resources, and that was really amazing. And then the person in the center is a participant. I think a lot of groups have been very successful in having their participants share knowledge. Our participants do know a lot. Many of them go to college. And if they don't know something, we've had people volunteer. Like when you go to Har Herzl, people can, everyone has their phone. They can spend 5 or 10 minutes going on Wikipedia and researching who Yonatan Netanyahu was. So it's another way to. So it's great tour educators. It's another great part of the trip. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Israel's commitment to accessibility. And I want to give a shout out. Two of the participants in today's session are friends and really dear friends and colleagues. My friend Jamie Lassner is here from Friends of Access Israel, Phaser. He's the guy in the wheelchair holding the basket on the left side. And my other friend, Omer Tsur, who is that good-looking guy who was talking so eloquently in the video about, he is the person who designed that very special chair on the left called Paratrek. And I'll talk first about Access Israel and about this Dinner of the Senses. And again, these are things that might be things to do more on your own trips to Israel with friends and family, but it really shows that Israel is really being seen as a world leader in accessibility. It's not perfect. I remember years ago, gaps in the curb, gaps in the sidewalk taking a wheelchair, but Israel has really gotten there. Access Israel is an organization started about 20 years ago by a helicopter pilot who became paralyzed when his Apache helicopter went down, and then long story started Access Israel. And now every year, except for this year because of COVID, there's an international conference on accessibility. People come from like 20 some countries, 800 people. In the center, they do these amazing simulation activities, which on one hand could be a little bit controversial, but it's done so beautifully so that people with disabilities are teaching these skills. So Jamie and the rest of us got to try one of those cool wheelchairs for wheelchair basketball, being taught by a person who uses a wheelchair and is a good athlete. On the right, this was called Dinner of the Senses, where people with that disability teach you about that disability. And then on the left, Omer, whose father became paralyzed during the Yom Kippur War, wanted to find a way. How do people with and without disabilities hang out together and go hiking in Israel and around the world? And that led Omer and his dad to design this Paratrek. And as you can see, the person who's in the chair in the trekker, they call it, and as well as the team get to work together to get places. And Jamie and Omer and I are very proud to say that we actually we went to Tanzania in February, and we climbed Kilimanjaro with 4 people who are paralyzed. So this really, imagine how nice it is for Israel's Hasbara when people in Tanzania are looking at you, people from around the world, and they see that that Israel is behind this, designing this thing so people with disabilities can go to Israel. So just a couple of other slides about accessibility. Israel's really getting there. This is an accessible beach. This is a way to go into the Dead Sea. On the Access Israel trip, we had somebody said in the chat about buses that are accessible. I never knew that there were buses in Israel that have lifts. You don't see too many of them. Tour buses. We had probably a couple dozen people having to get up and down a lift in Israel, and they were raving about the access points in the Tel Aviv beaches so that you could get there, if you're not able to walk so easily. Next slide. So I want to talk with you about kind of my overall goal in this. And again, I wish we'd be able to have much more of a conversation. And this is something that I'm passionate about. And at the end, I have my contact. I'm happy to speak further. There's this. The real point in all of this is, how can you bring whatever are kind of best practices in sort of special education kind of back to education in general. So there's this very well-known phrase. It happened to be in this guy's article, but I've heard it dozens of times over the years, that special education is just good education. It's not to take away from the fact that we have degrees and departments of special education, but the point is that there are things that we use in special education to teach diverse learners that would be useful to everyone. So the idea of like visuals, or breaking down activities into smaller parts, or saying this activity is going to end in 5 minutes, guys. 5 minutes, we're getting out of the Dead Sea, we're going to go change our clothes. So that it really is for everyone else. Okay, which brings me to push it a step further. Especially birthright Israel trips are just good birthright trips. So to bring us back to what we said in the beginning, any trip needs to be well planned and predictable as possible. It should be multi-sensory. You need awesome staff, and I think most of the people on this session are those attentive staff members. You need great tour educators. And I put something peculiar at the end. I put down well publicized. So I'm coming, kind of near the end here. And as I wrap up, I want to tell you about the first trip that I took. It was amazing. Like I said, I'm a big fan of Shorashim, great trip. And I just felt like I needed to track down Liz Sokalski, who is the executive director of Birthright North America. And I asked if I could meet with her. And I said, Liz, my only criticism of your Birthright trips is one thing and one thing only. And she was a little bit dumbfounded. And I said, it's that you don't get the word out well enough about these special trips, these specialty trips that we had on that first slide that many of you knew about, for people who are deaf and people with Asperger's and mobility challenges and medical issues, inflammatory bowel disease, many people who are in recovery. And I said, that really needs to be our challenge, because if I can't find out these programs except by Googling special birthright trips, who else is going to know about it? So she took me very seriously and put together a Taglit Birthright Israel Accessibility and Inclusion Task Force, which I was part of. And out of that came this Accessibility and Inclusion Birthright Israel Standard. And this is obviously a very structured organization. It's gotten passed. It was passed. It's shared with the trip organizers, and there in this pamphlet it lists all the different trips with explanations. And really, what I would ask for everybody on this call in return, now that you know about it, is to be our shlichim, help spread the word. You're going to know someone who has a sibling who has autism and thought they'd never get to go to Israel, right? And they can, right? And I think even the ages, there's been talk about pushing even further. We want people to go to Israel. I mean, it really is a birthright. And it really shouldn't matter if there's a medical issue, a mobility issue. It's really Israel for everyone. So with that, I'll end. And if there are any, I guess, Joel, you can let me know if we want to take questions by raising hands or in the chat. I'd love to answer any questions, and I will share my my contact information here. But thanks for joining. Any questions anybody has or thoughts or?
If you do have a question, thanks Howard for this really informative session. If you do have a question, just unmute yourself and jump on. We have a few more minutes on the call. So if you have a question about really anything, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
I'm curious how you deal with, we were just talking about all of the sensory, you know, in the markets, there's the colors, there's the sounds, there's the whatever. I feel like I have sensory overload anytime I go to the market. So in those instances, I'm curious about how you handle that, how you prepare for that, as it relates, of course, to the specialty trips.
It's a great question. So now I'll tell you all the things we got wrong. Now that you listen to all these we got right, the follow-up webinar is all these we got wrong. So I will tell you, it's a great question, and it is sensory overload. Israel can be sensory overload. Going to Machane, I mean, I was the crazy person who took people to Machane Yehuda, like Davka, on a Thursday or Friday, so people could see the hustle and bustle. And it worked for a couple of years until we went to a very small restaurant, and people started freaking out. I mean, it was really, people started really getting claustrophobic, and we really had to get people out of there quickly, right? I would say that we try to minimize that. Some of the other things we've gotten wrong are things like, you know, I could give a whole thing about how amazing it is to go to the food courts and be able to order what you want and experience that. But sometimes it's been a disaster. And so we're getting better. We're getting better at anticipating it. I think a lot of times it's you know, really touching base with your team members, with the other staff members, and saying, you know, like, I know that I'm crazy about this thing. This is my thing. I want to bring everyone to Machane Yehuda, but tell me if I'm crazy and if this is the wrong group for that. And sometimes, you know, what works for one group doesn't work for another group, or what you know, maybe we'll say, you know, who's got this person one-to-one? You know, Zach, I need you with this person. And it really does involve, it may be involved 2-to-1ing a certain person just so the group can get through it, or a pre-teaching. You know, this is going to be a really, you know, loud place. It's very narrow. We did take the group through Machane Yehuda. I was nervous about it, and we went in very small groups. We kind of figured out, you know, which staff wanted to eat certain things. You know, we had the little, what do you call those, the coupons. You know, we knew who wanted to go where and kind of who needed to buy what. And we went in really small groups with check-ins. But I think you're right. I think it can be. And the other thing that I would say about a specialty group is that sometimes some guides, you know, guides are amazing. Some guides, not the ones on our trips, but some guides sort of measure their own success by how much they got you to do in one day. We did all 12 things on the list, and we have to say, you know what? Oh, like, can we think about this? Maybe we should cut this one thing out. That's why we don't, you know, Michael and Joel and the team are good about not putting it down exactly how it is. It's more general, and we may have to cut something, and we have before. Sometimes what you need to do is get back to the, you know, go to get ice cream, or and cut out something. Obviously, ideally you don't want to cut out masada or something like that, though it could happen. But you know, you have to just be able to roll with the punches, and you know, not measure success by what you think every trip has to do all these things, and say, you know what, sometimes I've had trips where while we were opting out of something like that third museum of the day, we sat down like one of those little neighborhood, you know, like parks in like Zichron Yaakov, and while you're in the park, a group of like Israeli Arab kids were kicking around a soccer ball, and the group just naturally got involved in an informal soccer game. And to me, that was way more important than that one more museum might have been. And just being able to sort of say, okay, it's all good. You know, I don't know if that answers your question, but I totally agree with you.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic, and
Of
that
course.
video was amazing. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks to Birthright for that.
Howard, I have a question about level of communication with parents and before the trip and during the trip, how that differs from regular birthright trips.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So, we do a lot. So it starts off with the assessment for goodness of fit. And, this is what's different than a more typical trip. You fill out the application, and unless there's something that's flagged, I assume you're pretty much accepted. But here, we interview the person and the parents. There's things in writing. We usually talk to two professionals who, either one person for sure by phone and one person in writing. It could be a therapist, it could be a teacher, someone who's going to sign off on this person. And there's a lot of communication with the parents. I mean, I know it's tricky because this person is chronologically, 25, but the people know that they have disabilities. These are some issues that they have. Parents will say, my young man is going to like blow all of his money on the first day. He doesn't understand how shekels work. Can you help him? Or, I know that you don't do medication, but, I'm really worried about that. And we'll have these honest conversations. And the other thing is I try, before I go to sleep at night, no matter what time it is, we always do a blog and send photographs. I find that that always cuts down on the number of, worried calls you get, because I saw my son at Masada, amazing, so, but we do that kind of, I think it's important, to have that kind of communication. And we've, I see that, Liz Robbins, one of the people on the call, one of our staff members, she's been on a team, she's been on a team where we have these conversations on the front end. Like, is this the right trip? Maybe they should be on a typical trip, maybe with support, maybe they should be on a special trip. The nobody, one of the things that's come up that, again, this is like for part 3 about, being an inclusive trip, right? Something that I've learned, I always believe that you have to have all kinds of options because it's not one size fits all. And, you could have a person with a disability like Asperger's included on a typical trip, and they are literally included on the list of participants, but then it might be marginalized and put on the side. While everyone's carrying on and having a good time, they're kind of not included. Flip that around. When we've had the Asperger's trip, we've had people say, this is the first time I've made a friend. Like people, we had someone on one of our trips, nighttime came, and the person took out one of those card games and said, I have this card game called Werewolf. We could have up to 20 players. Anybody want to come? And for hours, people played cards, and people said, wow, I made a friend. Like, they weren't sort of pushed to the side. So that to me is one of the most exciting things. But there's a lot of communication. And again, Shorashim has been great about all that communication. And we also, I didn't say, one of the hardest day of the whole trip is takeoff day, because our flight gets to the airport 12 hours in advance, 12 hours to JFK. And some of them have started off their own days in Chicago at like 4 a.m. And we meet every single person at the gate. So, I sit in one place, the staff says, these two from United from Chicago, and that goes on for like 12 hours until we finally take off at midnight. And this time we started to provide food because it's a long time. You can't buy food at JFK, but really trying to think of everything for success, because it's not easy. But once it's so worth it. And I feel so proud that Birthright offers these trips, and Shorashim has been amazing. Thanks for the question, Jay.
Is there any talk of when the next trip will take place?
The next Birthright, the next Asperger's trip or Birthright? That's a good. I should ask Michael or Joel. I know that this trip is supposed to take place every December, and that's been our goal. But I'll defer to our team.
Yeah. So I'll jump in for that question. So we do this trip typically in December. We do them in December because of largely the weather. Summertime is a little bit too hot for this population. And as of now, I mean, Birthright Israel trips, so May, June, July, and August have been postponed. And we're still planning on running this one December time this year. So they run once a year. and we typically have a huge number of interest in this one trip. What Howard was saying at the beginning, we have 22 North American participants and 6 staff members. So Howard is one of them. So there's the typical, or the typical Birthright Israel trip is 40 North American, about 40 North Americans. So it's a much smaller group with many more staff. And so we're still planning on doing this December.
Just to jump off that one, thank you everyone for joining. My name is Michael Waits. I'm the North American director of Shorashim. And this past winter was our 12th Asperger's trip that we ran, and very successful. And thank you to Howard, and I see Zach's on the call, and Liz is on the call. Some of our other staff members that have been staffing the trip for a few years. And we've also partnered with other communities to run special needs trips in the past, with Philly and Cincinnati and Los Angeles. So we've been pretty involved for the last 13, 14 years running these trips. And it's always great to have great partners with our staff on the call, and some other community partners that are very helpful with recruiting people like Jody Newmark and Paula Harris. So thank you all for all the help in making the trip successful, and looking forward to the upcoming trips and the success that we get from running the trips. Is afterwards, Howard typically gets a lot of emails from the parents. They go to Howard directly, and he forwards it to Joel and Trudy and myself, and the feedback from the trip, it really makes what we're doing so special and so unique. So thank you, Howard, and to your team to make it all happen. And we know it's a stressful 10 days on the ground, so thank you for doing it.
Cool. With that, I think we can wrap up here. If you guys do have any questions, I'm happy to pass along Howard's information that he included in the slide. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll keep you posted about more of these in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
And thanks, Howard.
Thank you.